for many, many years with colleagues on both sides of the aisle, and very pleased that we've been able to get this legislation to this point. It's now time to act on behalf of American workers and American businesses. I yield back the floor.
The clerk will call the roll. Mr. Kaka.
Mr. President,
The distinguished senior senator from Utah.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be rescinded.
Without objection.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. As we discuss our relationship with China, it strikes me that we're ignoring one of the most critical issues impacting U.S. competitiveness in regard to China, namely China's inadequate protection of U.S. intellectual property, or what I call IP. Let's remember that intellectual property is our nation's #1 export. American IP underpins the knowledge economy, providing our workers and companies with a significant competitive advantage. In short, IP equals jobs for American workers. It's that simple. Studies have shown that the IP-intensive industries employ more than 19 million workers, create higher-paying jobs across all skill levels, and support more than 60% of total U.S. exports. That's why throughout my service here, I've endeavored to ensure that U.S. innovators and content creators are able to operate in an environment in which their IP, or intellectual property, is adequately protected. Now, I'm pleased to have been the lead Republican sponsor of the recently enacted America Invents Act, which resulted in long overdue reforms to our nation's patent system, which will strengthen our economy, create jobs, and provide a springboard for further improvements to our intellectual property laws. And I was very pleased to see Senator Grassley take that over as the new ranking member of the committee and do such a great job with it. And I want to pay tribute to the distinguished senator from Vermont, Senator Leahy, as well, and to my colleagues in the House who saw the importance of that particular new law. It's the first time we've modified the patent laws in over 50 years, and that was a historic event. So it's pretty apparent that I take a great interest in intellectual property and all aspects of it. I'm the chairman of the Republican Senatorial High-Tech Task Force, and I have to say that it is really a privilege to work with these brilliant people who work in the intellectual property areas, many of whom are in Silicon Valley out there in California, but we have our own Silicon Valley in Utah that is becoming very, very well known, a lot of innovation, and we have most of the really great companies right there in Utah as well. Now, U.S. leadership in innovation has not gone unnoticed by our economic and strategic competitors who are adopting and evolving innumerable tactics to steal, expropriate, or otherwise undermine our intellectual property rights. Few, however, have been as overt in these efforts as China. The statistics on counterfeiting and piracy alone are staggering. According to a recent report by the U.S. International Trade Commission, firms in the U.S. IP-intensive economy that conducted business in China in 2009 reported losses of approximately $48.2 billion, that's with a B, dollars in sales, royalties, or license fees due to IP infringement in China. Now that bears repeating. $48.2 billion in losses for U.S. companies due to intellectual property infringement in China. Perhaps most disturbingly, the ITC report noted that companies reported that an improvement in IP protection and enforcement in China to levels comparable to that in the U.S. would likely increase employment by 2.5%. Think what that would do for our country. That amounts to almost 1 million U.S. jobs. And these aren't just jobs. These are really good jobs. And these jobs are jobs that would benefit our country a great deal. But counterfeiting and piracy do not stop at China's border. Based on U.S. border seizure statistics, China is the primary source of counterfeited products in the United States. Now, these counterfeited products from China run the gamut. We're talking about counterfeit toys, fake drugs, fake auto and aircraft parts, counterfeit computer chips, and counterfeit software, music, movies, and games. In essence, anything and everything that has value in the sights of Chinese counterfeiters. You can imagine if you're flying on an airplane and the parts that they thought were valid and good parts all of a sudden quit working. This is a very, very important point that I'm making here. Now, clearly this is not incidental. It's pervasive. And given China's system of government, it's fair to draw the conclusion that piracy and counterfeiting has explicit or implicit government approval, for there's little doubt that China would deal severely with any other activity they found objectionable well before it became pervasive. And if they wanted to, they could clean this up. And I hope that they will, because it's very much to the disadvantage of our country. Now, it's becoming clearer every day that China's failure to protect U.S. intellectual property is part of a well-coordinated government national economic development plan. Nowhere is this more obvious than in China's adoption of plans to promote, quote, indigenous innovation, unquote. China's indigenous innovation policies disadvantage U.S. innovators through rules and regulations which mandate the transfer of valuable technology, and rules which provide preferential treatment for intellectual property which is developed in China. In addition, there have been continued attempts to use technology standards as both a means to erect barriers to U.S. technology and as a means to unfairly acquire really valuable U.S. technology. Now, this is not to say that China has not made any progress in combating the theft of U.S. intellectual property. Certainly, the commitments made at the recent JCCT meeting regarding indigenous innovation and government procurement were a positive step, as was the website Baidu's recent agreement to license legitimate content from certain IP owners. But while these actions are a good start, there's a lot more that needs to be done. We can debate currency manipulation all day long, but if we want to foster immediate job growth in the United States, we should focus our energies on working to find ways to staunch the bleeding when it comes to the benefit of American innovation by China. Again, we're talking about close to 1 million good-paying jobs, U.S. jobs, which stand to be created if we can get this problem under control. And I stand ready to work with my colleagues on this important set of issues. But these are important issues, and it's time that China grow up and get into the world community and do what's right. It's a wonderful land. They have tremendous capacities. They're brilliant people. A lot of their engineers were educated here. They're people who really deserve to be leaders in the world community if they live in accordance with basically honest rules of the world community. Now, they don't live in accordance with these rules, and they could do a much better job on intellectual property than they've done. I've been there a number of times, and each time I've gone there, I've raised the intellectual property issues. I've raised the piracy issues. And they always say they're going to do something about these issues, but when push comes to shove, they really don't do what really needs to be done. Now, another important issue we need to discuss is enforcement, and that is why I filed Amendment number 679. My amendment requires the Comptroller General of the United States to submit an annual report to the Congress on the trade enforcement activities of the Office of the United States Trade Representative, or we'll refer to it as USTR. This is a simple amendment, but serves a vitally important purpose. USTR is a relatively lean agency as compared to much of the bloated federal bureaucracy. It's at the front lines in our efforts, to open new markets to U.S. goods and services providers, and it leads the way in holding our trading partners accountable when they fail to live up to their trade commitments. It's a tough job. U.S. companies face an unrelenting onslaught of governments and NGOs which collaborate in seeking new ways to hamper America's economic competitiveness by undermining our intellectual property rights, by imposing unwarranted sanitary and phytosanitary measures that have no basis in science, by enacting new technical barriers to trade, imposing unfair pricing and regulatory regimes upon our industries, and other equally harmful measures. Our goal, of course, should be to eliminate every single one of these. But the reality of the situation is that in a world of limited resources, we must prioritize. To my mind, the number one priority should be removing barriers to our exports of goods and services and eliminating foreign government practices which most impact U.S. jobs and economic well-being. Unfortunately, that has not been the case under this administration. Unfortunately, that's the situation we find ourselves in. To cite an example, most people realize that China is an enormous problem for U.S. innovators and content creators. Our companies face policies designed to foster Chinese innovation at the expense of U.S. innovators, the imposition of standards-based barriers, a continued refusal to direct adequate resources towards stemming counterfeiting and piracy in both the online and physical realms, and other policies, laws, and regulations that diminish the value of United States intellectual property. To date, this administration has not filed a single intellectual property-related enforcement action against China. Similarly, Chile continues to flagrantly violate the terms of our bilateral free trade agreement with regard to crucial protections for intellectual property. Despite the direct and demonstrable harm to American innovators and workers, no dispute settlement process has been initiated with regard to Chile's failure to adequately protect intellectual property in accordance with the terms of our free trade agreement that we've entered into with them. In contrast, after 3+ years of devoting significant resources to intensive negotiations with the government of Guatemala, the Obama administration announced the initiation of the first ever bilateral labor dispute against an FTA partner. The administration also recently announced that it will investigate allegations by a Peruvian union that government of Peru has violated its labor obligations under the U.S.-Peru Free Trade Agreement. To me, these actions demonstrate skewed enforcement priorities. It is hard to believe that Guatemala's alleged failure to adequately enforce its own domestic labor laws is anywhere near the top of the list when it comes to trade barriers facing U.S. companies and workers. I also find it hard to believe that expending critical enforcement dollars to defend the interests of the Peruvian labor union should be among the top trade enforcement policies for this administration. China, India, Brazil, Russia, and Chile are some of the many countries where we face very real threats to American industry and competitiveness due to unfair trade practices and barriers. But instead of focusing on these immediate, ongoing, and very real economic harms, the administration seeks yet again to instead score political points with labor union leadership. Now, I can hardly blame them for that in a sense because the trade unions in this country are the biggest supporters of the president and of the Democrats. But it's outrageous to not put our country first under the circumstances. It really is outrageous. And I think even the trade unions are going to have to stop and think about, is this administration really doing what's right with regard to our interests in all these countries I've just mentioned? It's outrageous to direct the limited resources of our most important trade agency towards activities that have little to do with opening new markets or protecting U.S. jobs. This inability to prioritize based upon what's best for workers and the economy as compared to what's best for building labor union support is another unfortunate example of the administration's inability to lead on trade. My amendment requires the Comptroller General on a yearly basis to detail the enforcement activities undertaken by the USTR and assess the economic impact of each such activity, including the impact on bilateral trade and on employment in the United States. It would also include an assessment of the cost of and resources dedicated to each such activity. Now, I'm hopeful that my amendment will assist this and future administrations in setting rational enforcement priorities. By providing an objective measure of the likely impact on trade and employment of any enforcement activities undertaken, it will also be an important resource for this and future Congresses in the conduct of our oversight responsibilities. I would hope that all of my Senate colleagues could support an amendment which provides us with important information and insights which will help us in ensuring that USTR utilizes taxpayer funds in the most effective manner possible towards opening markets and removing barriers to U.S. companies and workers. Now, Mr. President, I rise again today in support of my Amendment 680. First, allow me to further explain some of my underlying concerns with the current bill's approach. Now, we've heard many estimates of job losses in the U.S. associated with our trade deficit with China, following China's entry into the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Unfortunately, most of those estimates are highly unreliable and should be taken with a large amount of skepticism. We have heard numbers coming out of the Labor-Backed Economic Policy Institute, or EPI, saying that 2.8 million U.S. jobs have been lost or displaced because of trade deficits with China since that country's entry into the WTO, with 1.9 million of those jobs estimated to have been in manufacturing. Unfortunately, those estimates come from an unreliable static analysis which essentially says that imports displace labor used in domestic production and therefore lead directly to job loss and unemployment. Now, looking at this particular chart here, you can see from that chart that the relation between U.S. imports, the blue line, and the unemployment rate, which is the red line, and you can see how it's shot up since 2008 and is still wavering at the top, does not seem to conform to the jobs and unemployment claims being made with some of the numbers being used in our current debate. If anything, a casual observer might even say that when import growth is strong, it tends to be associated with a strong underlying economy, one in which unemployment is relatively low. Now, you can see from this chart that the imports were going up throughout the first part of 2000 to 2008 when it hit the pinnacle, and all of a sudden dropped down with this administration. Now they're coming back up. But the unemployment rate has now gone up tremendously, and it doesn't seem to be coming down very far. So there's a correlation here. And frankly, one that really concerns me, as the chart suggests, following the pro-growth tax relief of 2003, the economy began to pick up some steam, imports correspondingly grew, and the unemployment rate fell until the financial crisis hit. That unemployment rate went down. The 2.8 million job loss number from the labor-funded think tank, or the 1.6 million job loss number that the majority leader recently mentioned here on the floor, and many of the other job loss numbers associated with the China currency issue that are being offered by many of my colleagues on the other side of the floor, are highly unreliable and often not much different from numbers simply picked out of thin air. The jobs numbers do not account for dynamic flows of workers from industry to industry, and the message being delivered is that if a job in an industry went away and net imports were going up, then the job must have been lost or displaced because of trade. Well, that's foolish. What happened to the displaced worker? The analysis doesn't take that into account and merely suggests misleadingly that the worker is unemployed. What happens to the dollars that are associated with financing any increased net imports? The analysis doesn't take that into account. If we run a higher trade deficit, finance it with dollar outflows, and foreign countries recycle the dollars back into treasury bills to finance the president's stimulus spending spree, does the analysis take into account the resulting jobs that the president claims become, quote, saved or created, unquote? No. Those jobs numbers are only convenient when advocates of stimulus like the EPI wish to promote more debt-fueled government spending. Now, I do not dispute that there are important dynamic effects of international trade on the U.S. labor market. I do dispute many of the numbers being tossed about and offered as estimates of job losses stemming from trade with China. I do dispute that dealing with our bilateral trade deficit with China is the most important thing we can do for jobs today, as the Senate Majority Leader has suggested. Those doubts, of course, are not reasons to not act on the Chinese currency issue, but they do lead me to doubt the job creation priorities of my friends on the other side of the aisle. The President has been actively campaigning for congressional consideration and passage of the so-called American Jobs Act. Right now, today. Yet the Majority Leader here in the Senate refuses to let us consider the President's proposal right now, despite the Minority Leader having introduced a proposal for Senate consideration. Evidently, Senate Democrats believe that construction of a new mechanism to use to confront China and raise prospects of trade wars is more important to jobs than the President's plan. I don't think so. The President states, rightfully so, that unemployed American workers don't have 14 months to wait for action on jobs. Yet we're considering a currency bill that, at best, would set in motion a lengthy process of currency misalignment determinations and perhaps ensuing trade sanctions. Now, if anyone believes that the process set up in the currency bill to confront any currency misalignment in existence today will lead to job creation right now or in the next 14 months, then I suggest that they do not understand much about international trade, labor markets, and often painfully slow processes of international trade negotiations. Now, it took President Obama over 2.5 years to send 3 free trade agreements to Congress, deals that were all set to go from the day he took office. Now, do you really believe that the legislation before us, even if it went into effect right now, would lead to a fundamental misalignment finding immediately along with rapid ensuing dialogue and action that would lead to job creation right now? Even if the legislation before us today were implemented today, it would likely take months and years before it achieved any results. It is important to confront existing currency misalignments and global imbalances, the sources of which include persistently high amounts of U.S. debt made significantly worse during the past 3 years of deficits in excess of $1 trillion that were used wastefully on so-called, quote, stimulus, unquote, and commercially non-viable green energy experiments that just plain did not work. People are starting to wake up to this type of approach to government. To say that the issue of China's managed currency peg is the most important issue for job creation today is telling. And it certainly does not speak well for how the President's Jobs Act is perceived by his Senate Democrat colleagues as a job creator. Now, my concerns go beyond some of the claims related to job creation. I am afraid the current bill will be ineffective and could actually end up harming our exporters through retaliation. That's a real fear. It's a real concern, especially since the Chinese have said they will retaliate. And we don't need that right now with the economy the way it is. But that's what they're going to do if this bill passes, even though some might think that's the right thing to do. And I'm not the only one with concerns. Today, according to an article by the Associated Press, the White House finally publicly stated that it has concerns with this legislation. And while we still don't know what those specific concerns are, we do know that they believe approval of the bill would be counterproductive. Now, we know that. Why doesn't the administration just come out and say it? Why is it that the President can't lead on these issues? Why is it that he always calls on Congress to lead on these issues? That's why we elected him as President. Or should I say that's why they elected him as President. Because I didn't vote for him, even though I like him personally. I did vote for my colleague John McCain. Now, similar concerns were expressed today in an opinion editorial by the New York Times entitled, quote, the wrong way to deal with China, unquote. They call this bill a, quote, bad idea, unquote, and, quote, too blunt of an instrument, unquote. Specifically, they state that the bill is very unlikely to persuade China to change its practices, noting that instead, quote, add an explosive new conflict to an already heavy list of bilateral frictions, unquote. Now, that's the New York Times. My goodness. That is pretty much the Bible for our folks on the other side here. And they do write very effectively on some of these issues. Now, I agree that currency manipulation is a serious problem, and I have proposed a better way to address it. My amendment empowers the administration to work within existing frameworks to mitigate the effects of current manipulation and to stop it from occurring. And if our negotiators can't make progress in the WTO and IMF, we go there first. We must go outside these organizations and align with other like-minded countries to confront the Chinese currency interventions together. I couldn't agree more with my colleagues who have introduced the bill we are debating, that China's beggar-thy-neighbor currency policies do harm the United States and our workers. And from that standpoint, I commend my colleagues. But massive currency interventions harm many other economies and their workers as well. We should join together in a pluralistic way to counter China's actions and negotiate a long-term solution to stop the fundamental misalignment of currencies, whether by China or any other country. And if we did that, it would bring tremendous worldwide pressure on China rather than acting in a bilateral fashion, which this bill will do. My amendment would allow that to occur. I'd be happy to give credit to the other side if they'd accept that amendment. They have to know that it's a prescient, worthy amendment, something that really would make a difference, rather than just making talking points or creating a trade war with a country that we should work towards getting along. Appreciating the Chinese currency will help address global macroeconomic imbalances and serve China's long-term economic interests as well, while ensuring that American businesses, farmers, manufacturers, service providers, and workers compete on a level playing field. Now, I just introduced this amendment yesterday around noon, and I am pleased that many of my colleagues have reviewed my substitute bill, and they do support it and support a different approach. I think if we want to work together, it's a perfect way of doing it, because it gets what the folks want on this side without, and brings the right kind of pressure without causing a huge trade war that is going to be very much to our disadvantage. In addition, since the introduction of my amendment, many business associations, advocacy groups, think tanks, and others have come out in support of my substitute bill. Now, I didn't file that for political reasons. I didn't file that to just cause trouble. I filed it because these ideas in that bill are far superior to the ideas in the underlying bill. And I think my friends on the other side ought to look at it and tell me where they can improve it and take it over, if they will. But the fact of the matter is it's far superior to what the underlying bill is. Now, many agree that my approach is our best choice or best chance at solving this problem that we all find so frustrating. To those who think this is more of the same old approach, I say absolutely not. The old policies and the old Exchange Rate Act have not worked, and they need to go. On that, I think we all agree. My proposal does not say try and work this out with China and hope for the best. Instead, my approach directs our negotiators to work with others and challenge China until a solution is agreed to. My approach does not prevent the United States from taking unilateral action, but it does demand that the administration seek out those countries that will join our efforts to combat currency manipulation so that our actions are more effective and bring worldwide pressure on China to do what's right and to be more fair. We do need a bold new approach, and we need to empower our negotiators to work within the WTO and IMF to ensure a level playing field for American businesses and workers. But if they cannot do that there, and these institutions cannot handle this problem, then we must join with other like-minded countries to act in concert to counter China's currency policies outside the WTO and IMF. This bill is going to cause a tremendous dislocation if it passes, and it's going to cause a trade war that is much to our disadvantage. It may make good populist talk, but it will be very much to our disadvantage, and in the end won't do what they want it to do. My bill will. It may take some effort, but my bill will. And if they cannot do, if they can't confront these existing currency misalignments and global imbalances, the way we're suggesting, they can't do that there, and these institutions cannot handle this problem, then we have to join other like-minded countries to act in concert to counter China's currency policies outside the WTO and IMF. Now, that's what real leadership's about. That's what real executive branch leadership should be about. That's what real USTO should be about, USTR should be about. But we also need a partner. We need an administration that will lead on this issue. If I have an objection to this administration, it's that they don't lead on anything. They didn't set up a budget. Well, the one thing they did failed 97-0. But they really have not taken it seriously, and they just wait for Congress to act and for Congress to do these things. Well, that's what we elected the President to send up his approach to this. That's what we elected him for, and he ought to do that, but they don't for some reason. And we also need a partner. We need an administration that will lead on this issue. My amendment will hold the administration accountable until they achieve results, and that's whether it's this administration or a successive administration. We are debating today which approach will better solve the chronic currency manipulation problem with China. My approach has been endorsed by the Americans for Tax Reform, who said that the Hatch Amendment, quote, offers a sensible approach that utilizes the mechanisms created by the international trade community to resolve such disputes, unquote. The Emergency Committee for American Trade says that the Hatch Amendment, quote, will more effectively address concerns about currency misalignment by China and other countries without opening the door to many harmful effects on U.S. business and workers, unquote. The Retail Industry Trade Association also supports my amendment, as does the Financial Services Roundtable. This amendment is already generating significant support. Why don't my friends on the other side take it, declare victory, and go from there? They can refile it in their name. It'll be fine with me. I don't care who gets the credit for it. I just care that we handle it in a way that makes sense, rather than just make a bunch of political points that frankly, will irritate the daylights out of our friends in China. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and let's all agree to hold the administration accountable and any successive administration accountable, and work with other like-minded countries to challenge China's currency practices. And, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to yield the floor at this point.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that at the conclusion of the remarks by the distinguished senator from Ohio that I be recognized.
Without objection.
President.
Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. President. I said to Senator Inhofe I would be no more than 10 minutes, and I appreciate your courtesy and your being here. Mr. President, I rise in opposition to the Hatch Amendment. I appreciate my colleague from Utah, his proposal to negotiate a solution with China and other nations on currency. I've worked with him on the Health, Education, Labor, Pension Committee, as the presiding officer has, and appreciate his concern on all of these issues and his wide range of knowledge. My firm belief, however, is his amendment's not going to work. I know that he generally doesn't want to take the same direction we do on standing up to the Chinese here, and I think that when you talk about multilateral negotiation, you're pretty much saying to the Chinese, please stop a strategy, however unfair and in violation of international norms, that has helped your country accumulate enormous wealth. Please stop. We hope you'll stop. Please stop. Or you're saying what Fred Bergsten calls you're saying, please stop what Fred Bergsten says is the most protectionist policy any major country has taken since World War II. you know, we've tried this. We now have the ability to do multilateral negotiations. Senator Hatch is right. The administration is not particularly led on that. He's also right to add that the Bush administration also didn't particularly lead on that. And before that, the Clinton administration did not particularly lead on that. I mean, we have the ability now, without Amendment 680, because it would really add nothing significant to the procedures and the steps that are already in place as a matter of current law and practice, to do these negotiations. We have an administration, a Treasury Department that may change political parties from time to time, but doesn't change strategies in dealing with the Chinese. It's always, please stop. We hope you'll do something differently. We'd really like it if you'd change what you're doing. We really think it would be better if you're not cheating on currency and cheating on international trade policies. We really would like it, now that we let you into the World Trade Organization, if you'd actually follow the rules of the World Trade Organization. We think it'd be great if you'd follow the force of law and the rule of law. In saying those things has gotten us nowhere. That's why, while I respect Senator Hatch, Amendment 680 doesn't really get us anywhere. It doesn't really change the law. It really just delays. And we know how the Chinese like it when we delay, because every day we delay is one more day where the Chinese cheat, where the Chinese have an advantage, where the Chinese can, the People's Republic of China, the Communist Party, can again take advantage of American workers and American companies. The Treasury Department already has specific reporting and obligations. They already have ample authority to consult and negotiate bilaterally, multilaterally, plurality under the Exchange Rates and Economic Policy Coordination Act of 1988, which Amendment 680 would repeal. So, Mr. President, it's, you know, this, I appreciate what Senator Hatch wants to do, but the fact is we've got to make the Chinese understand, other than occasional pleading, occasional begging, occasional polite requests, we have to make them understand, if they don't stop manipulating their currency, if they don't stop intervening in their currency to keep a weaker yuan, a weaker renminbi, a weaker RMB, that the United States will defend itself. The United States can't turn its other cheek on this one. The presiding officer said to me the other day, the Chinese steal our lunch and they expect us, and if we take any of it back, they get all upset at us, although the presiding officer said it better than I just said it. But the fact is that you know, that the Chinese have not played fair. I used the example on the Senate floor of what currency manipulation means in very simple terms. If there's a gas station on Summit Street in Akron, and there's a gas station across the street, and there's two Marathon stations. One of the Marathon station gets its oil from Findlay, Ohio at a 30% discount, and the other station doesn't. The Marathon station that gets a discount is going to put the other one out of business, pure and simple. And that's what the Chinese, they have, as Senator Merkley said earlier today, there's a tariff on goods we sell to China, and there's a subsidy on goods China sells to us. So how do you compete with that? Amendment 680 won't help us compete with that. It'll just delay and delay and delay. And that doesn't make sense. That's why this legislation, the Senate Bill 1619, without the Hatch Amendment, makes much more sense. It allows us to move finally and quickly. It allows us to move with certainty. It allows us to move straightforwardly, but it doesn't, and it strips away all the delay and the head fakes and the fainting and all the things that the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party is so good at doing. So, Mr. President, I ask for defeat of the amendment and passage of 619, and I yield the floor for Senator Inhofe.
President.
Senator from Oklahoma.
I ask unanimous consent that at the conclusion of my remarks, the senator from Iowa, Senator Harkin, be recognized.
Without objection.
Mr. President, recently both the majority and the minority leaders came down to the floor to talk about the President's jobs bill. There was an effort to bring this bill up by the minority leader and objected to by the majority, and I understand that. But you know, all we've heard from the President from the very first time that he introduced this thing was pass the bill, pass the bill, pass the bill. And I know that there's some reason that he keeps using that phrase over and over again. It's probably been tested, and one that I think is going to, he believes, will move a lot of people. But frankly, I don't think it will, because too many people remember what happened last time he had a stimulus bill. And that's something that hasn't really been discussed on the floor in the consideration of this particular, what he refers to as a jobs bill. So I can see why he keeps talking about pass the bill, because he doesn't really want to talk about it. His new proposal reminds me so much of that $825 billion stimulus package that he ran through Congress shortly after entering office. It's almost the same thing. The Recovery Act, the $825 billion act, included only $27.5 billion in highway spending, which is the stimulus portion of that bill. Now, we're talking about 3% of the $825 billion. I'm particularly sensitive to this since I have in the past been the chairman of the Environment and Public Works Committee. I'm now the ranking member. We have a transportation reauthorization bill that we're trying to get up on a bipartisan basis. But back during the consideration of the Recovery Act, the $825 billion, I tried to pass an amendment on this floor to increase that to about 30% instead of 3% of the bill. If that had happened, we would not be in the situation that we're in today. We'd have a lot of jobs out there that would be under construction and good things would be happening. But in the case of this $447 billion bill, which is kind of the Recovery Act light, only $27 billion in highway spending. And it's just not conceivable that he didn't learn his lesson from the first go-around, that's the main reason that people are upset with it right now. And that's the reason he keeps saying, pass the bill, pass the bill. The proposal includes a few different things, but much of it will be sent to the President to spend however he wants. Now, you may be wondering, won't Congress tell the President where to spend the money? To a very limited extent, that's right. But when Congress does not tell the President exactly what he is to do with each dime he gets, the President gets to decide what to fund. And this administration has a history of making incredibly poor spending decisions with the money appropriated to it. The biggest example I can think of is the $825 billion stimulus package. When the President signed this bill in February of 2009, he said, and I want you to hold this thought. He said, and I'm quoting now, he said, what I'm signing then is a balanced plan with a mix of tax cuts and investments. It's a plan that's been put together without earmarks or the usual pork barrel spending. It's a plan that will be implemented with an unprecedented level of transparency and accountability. That's what he said. That's a direct quote. Well, for those of you who are watching, I have news for you. Despite the President's remarks, the spending wasn't balanced, and it had a tremendous amount of pork barrel earmark spending, even though there were no congressional earmarks. This is a distinction not many people make. I tried to get this point across back when Republicans very foolishly talked about having a moratorium on earmarks. I said, those are congressional earmarks. That's not where the problem is. The problem is in bureaucratic earmarks. Even the clearest and most recent example of a huge earmark was the loan guarantee that was given to Solyndra. We've all been reading about this and hearing about it recently. It's now a bankrupt solar panel manufacturing company. And we've heard about that. Solyndra was a politically connected firm from California, was able to lobby the White House to obtain a loan guarantee of $535 million to fund its green jobs pipe dream. Now, this happened despite the fact that some in the administration were warning the White House to give them more time to evaluate the company's finances. It seems they were concerned about the company's long-term viability. But these warnings were ignored by the White House. They wanted to fund the project anyway. Why? I think it's for two reasons. First, the White House fascination with green energy, and secondly, political gamesmanship. Some of Solyndra's biggest investors are big fundraisers for President, and have been big fundraisers for President Obama. And we now know that they made repeated visits to the White House and all that. So that is not just a coincidence. Another question is this. How did the White House have the authority to give the loan guarantee to Solyndra in the first place? The short answer is Obama's stimulus package. That was the $825 billion stimulus package. It significantly expanded the Department of Energy's loan guarantee program, and with this expansion, the White House was able to select Solyndra for a loan guarantee. So while the stimulus package did not include any pork barrel spending in the way that most people think about it, congressional earmarks, this provides clarity to the fact that when Congress does not explicitly state where taxpayer funds should go, the money is handed over to the administration to spend however he wants. It gets to earmark every last dime. And in the case of Solyndra, the president handed it over to his political buddies in favor of the green energy project. If that isn't a pork barrel project, I don't know what is. But now the damage has been done, and the taxpayers are going to be on the hook for as much as $535 million in losses. Now, sadly, Solyndra is just one example of the pork barrel spending of many of the stimulus in the stimulus bill. Now, we're talking about the first stimulus bill, the $825 billion bill. Not too long ago, Sean Hannity had on his program, I think it took him 2 programs to get it through, the 102 most egregious earmarks that are recorded. And it is really kind of interesting. In fact, I have the whole list here that I'm going to ask to be made a part of the record at the conclusion of my remarks. And I'd love to be able to go ahead and name all these things. Now, these are just ridiculous. $219,000 to study the hookup behavior of female college co-eds in New York, $1.1 million to pay for beautification of Los Angeles Sunset Boulevard, $10,000 to study whether mice become disoriented when they consume alcohol in Florida, $712,000. It goes on and on. And again, there are 102 of these things. These are the most egregious. But the interesting thing is, the day after Sean Hannity exposed these earmarks, 102 of them, I came to the floor, I read all 102 of them, and I said, what do these 102 earmarks have in common? The answer, not one is a congressional earmark. They're all bureaucratic earmarks. And that's what they all came from the $825 billion. Remember I said a minute ago that he said there will be no earmarks in this package? Now, the same thing he's saying about this second go-around for the jobs bill that he's talking about today. Well, anyway, the administration took $825 billion that Congress gave it and chose to spend it on stupid things like the ones I just listed. But there are 102 of them. And I hope people will take the time, since it's going to be in the record, to read all 102 of them. So what does this have to do with the jobs bill? To me, the jobs bill is simply the president coming back to Congress to ask for more money to spend however he wants on pork barrel projects like these. Now, no one's talked about this on the floor. They've talked about the other problems they have with this spending bill and why it's really not a jobs bill, but no one's talking about the fact this is exactly what he did before, and I don't know why we're not talking about this and featuring this, because if he said before there are going to be no earmarks, and then he had all these 102 egregious earmarks, why would he not do the same thing now? The answer is he would do it. He'd like to hand this out to his cronies in ways that would best benefit him. You may remember the President's State of the Union address from earlier this year. In it, he promised, and I quote, "If a bill comes to my desk with earmarks inside, I will veto it." Well, you have a promise from the President, unless Congress gives him all of the authority to determine how the money is spent through the bureaucratic earmark process, he'll veto the bill. In other words, he'll veto a bill unless he has total authority on how to spend it, and he can spend it on his own earmarks, in spite of the fact that he said there will be no earmarks. So, for any jobs bill to be considered, Congress is going to have to let the President decide how all of the money is being spent. It's a hard concept to get a hold of, because earmarks have become a dirty word, and people assume when you say earmarks, you're talking about congressional earmarks. That's not the problem. And I have legislation I'm going to be talking about that will correct this and better inform the public as to what is really going on. So we're finding ourselves in the same situation again. What's worse is the fact that the problem of bureaucratic earmarks is not limited to special stimulus packages. It's a normal course of business. And any given day, the administration is making thousands of decisions on how to spend money that it has appropriated. Congress first passes laws authorizing the executive branch to do certain things, and then we appropriate the money and go and do it. But unless Congress gives specific instructions as to where to spend the money, a process many people decry as congressional earmarks, then the administration gets to decide where to spend the money. In other words, the bureaucracy does the earmarking, or President Obama does. I can remember, I serve on the Armed Services Committee. We're staffed with experts in defending America. We have experts in missile defense, experts in lift capability, all of that. And the way it's always happened before is the president, whether that was President Bush or Clinton or any other president, they design a budget. In that budget, the parameters go to Congress. Then we in the authorization committees decide how that's going to, if we agree with the president, how he wants to defend America. A good example, right before the prohibition on earmarks came in, the president sent his budget down. I think this is his first budget. In that budget was $330 million for a launching system. It's called a bucket of rockets. It was a good system, something I'd like to have for defending America. But when we analyzed it, we looked and we thought, well, with what's happening right now, our greatest need is to expand our F-18 program and buy 6 new F-18s. So we took the $330 million that he would have spent on the rocket launching system and spent on 6 new F-18s. And it was the wise thing to do. Now, you can't do that now because the president has to make all the decisions because that would be called a congressional earmark. The earmarks don't increase spending at all. All they do is say, all right, Mr. President, you go ahead and spend it the way you want to. So a recent example of this comes from the Bureau of Land Management within the Department of Interior. While I can talk for hours about whether the management of federal lands is an appropriate thing for government to do, that's not what I want to bring attention to. That's another discussion for another time. What I'm concerned about is how carefully the Bureau of Land Management works to keep its actions aligned with the authorization and power it has been given by Congress. We write laws for a reason. We say the bureaucracy can do certain things and not do certain things. And when we do that, we're limiting the bureaucracy and the bureaucracy's authority. We are not saying they can interpret the law in any way that they choose, but generally that doesn't stop them from trying. One thing the Bureau of Land Management is authorized to do by statute is enter into contracts and cooperative agreements to manage, protect, develop, and sell public lands. In managing public lands, Title 43 authorizes the BLM to, among other things, preserve the land's historic value. A few days ago, as I was searching through the government's grants database, by the way, this database is something that we put in when Republicans were in majority in our committee, the Environment and Public Works Committee, a database which will show people, if they care to wander through, just what the bureaucracy is spending money on. Well, I was looking through the grants database. I came across one that shocked me. On September 9th of this year, just a few days ago, the BLM announced its intent to award a grant of $214,000 to the Public Land Foundation to fund a research project to describe in detail why the Homestead Act of 1862 had a significant impact on the history of America. When I asked them to justify that, they started talking about how important the history is. Well, today my question is this. What part of this grant has anything to do with the actual, today's actual public lands? This isn't a grant to dust off the historic landmarks at the National Park. This is a research project to study history, which that's what it's for. What the American people need to understand is that this sort of thing happens all the time. The bureaucracy is completely numb to the fact that we have $1.5 trillion deficit just in this year alone. And while this should inform the way it spends money and help to prioritize accordingly, it doesn't. The bureaucracy simply takes the money given to it by Congress and spends it on pork barrel projects that are important to the president. Right now, there's no way around this. There is no accountability or transparency built into it in any way that the bureaucracy's earmarks funds its earmarks. I believe this needs to be changed, and I'm currently drafting legislation that will change the way the bureaucracy makes funding decisions. My legislation will bring true transparency and accountability to the process, and it will require the administration to state explicitly the laws authorized in its grant awards. It will also provide a way for Congress to weigh in and challenge the administration's thinking. This is not just the current administration, it's any administration. And with the trillions of dollars in deficits, we can't afford to give the President another $447 billion to spend on whatever he wants, because that's what it would be. We need to reduce spending, but we also need to ensure that the spending we're doing is justified by the laws Congress passes. Because of this, we need to bring more light and accountability to the bureaucratic earmarking process. Further, I want my colleagues to not be fooled into the idea that whenever you pass money off to the administration, that it's in safe hands. The opposite is true. And I urge my colleagues to oppose more blank checks, stimulus spending because of it. Again, after the President Obama stated on February 17th, 2009, that there would be no earmarks in his $825 billion stimulus bill, it contained more than 100 really egregious, offensive earmarks. And I could, again, I'm not going to read off the list, but I'm going to make it a part of the record following this remark that I'm making now. He'll do it again. If we pass another $450 billion stimulus bill, we can be sure it'll be full of earmarks just as bad as the ones that he put in the initial stimulus bill. This is our second blank check for the President. He fooled us once. Don't let it happen again. And with that, I'll yield the floor.
Senator from Iowa.
Mr. President,